As we return to the distillery, we see that life is good for the group. Some are enjoying the relaxing art of fishing, whilst others are bustling away in the distillery, perfecting the art of booze. With their main aim being to increase production, the distillery has become a veritable hive of activity. Although Kanoish is in no way adverse to sunlight, Doc suggests that she works the night shift. With Jade's untimely demise, Pinion's the only one on the night shift at the moment, and Doc would hate to leave her on it without any company. Trying to utilise Kanoish's skills, Doc set her the task of turning all of their cloth into fancy dresses. He had hoped to use the cloth to make carpets to help beautify the village, but he lacked the knowledge of how to do it, and with the large abundance of leather they had from hunting, they had little use of the cloth for clothing themselves. Making it into dresses would give Kanoish a way to practice her craft, whilst also giving them some pretty dresses that they could sell. They would win over their future allies with their booze, but they would still need money to buy Thankarar and Haxton's new eyes, along with anything else they might need in the meantime. Although the mechanoid cluster at the entrance to the village had been thinned out by other raids, it did still sport a few active turrets, which were still causing trouble for some of the less sensible members of the group. One such misadventure by Dynapla led to a long night of guarding the perimeter wall to ensure that it didn't burn down. Thanks Dynapla, everyone's super happy you did that. Outside of the occasional fires caused by stupidity, things were blissfully quiet around the village, allowing the group plenty of time to simply make more booze. Within a few days they had another sizable stockpile, plenty enough to send another shipment out. They began loading a new drop pod to send off to the Green Inlet settlement to continue trying to win them over. The shipment worked a treat too, with the group finally securing their first actual allies in the region. The Green Inlet settlement were the first to buy into their booze-filled friendship, but they wouldn't be the last. Given that the chemshine was being kept separate from the other fermenting barrels for reasons of flammability, the current batch was at risk of being ruined from getting too cold sitting out in the fuel storage room. To remedy this, Doc decided to build an electric heater in the room. Some may question the decision to build a heater with an exposed electric element in a room full of fuel, but Doc preferred not to think of such things, and instead lived his life on a steady diet of hopes and wishful thinking. The only downside to their use of drop pods as a delivery method is that they weren't quite a renewable resource, as they tended to become a bit unusable after the first impact. As such, the distillery would need a large supply of steel in order to keep building new pods. There was still quite a lot of steel in the area, but with the mechanoids at the front of the village now being active, Doc preferred to keep the group close to the village, so ordered them to finish taking out the steel inside the hills at the front of the village. This would open up the entrance a little however, so he made sure to consult Dynapla on how best to adjust the defences to account for this, including adding some new stone walls and a stone door to replace some of the natural defences offered by the steel deposits. With the death of the poor Boomalope and the cold making growing chem route difficult, Doc was beginning to worry that they would run out of the fuel needed to send off their shipments. Thankfully, they'd already spent a lot of time researching chem fuel, so he had a solution. Feces. He could repurpose the village's feces to create chem fuel. This chem fuel could, in turn, power their drop pods, and could even be fermented into dangerous, volatile, intoxicating chemshine. They could literally make allies by dropping shit on them from the sky, and the people would thank them for it. Sometimes Doc was worried that he was a bit too much of a genius. One night, whilst most of the group are asleep, Pinion spots a cargo pod dropping nearby. Peering out into the distance, she can see that it appears to have contained a hat made of panthera fur. As undoubtedly badass as that would be to own, she can't help but feel that this is a cheap ploy from the mechanoids, to lure them out of the village. It has dropped just on the far side of the active mechanoid clusters after all. I guess panthera fur hat shall have to stay on her wish list for the time being. The crew had a few barrels of fecal sludge saved up from back before they built the sewer system, but if they wanted to make friends through their feces, they would need to start stockpiling some more of it, instead of flushing it all out into the river. With this in mind, they installed a septic tank into the sewer network. This could be used to store the feces until they decided to empty it and turn it into fuel. A combat supplier ship contacts the village on their communications console looking to trade with them. Doc gets a little excited, hoping that, specialising in combat, they may have some spare bionics that they use for field injuries. Sadly, they don't have much of interest and aren't overly interested in purchasing anything from the distillery. Dynapla secures an extra machine pistol for Kanosh and they call it a day. Sadly, whilst Dynapla was trading, Haxton was off role-playing as Dynapla and had wandered outside the village and right into the sights of the Met cluster. A single bullet from one of the turrets had made a real mess of her torso, but she was thankfully able to make it out of the range of the turret and back to the village to be tended back to health. Well, somewhat back to health. Turns out that the torso includes a lot of important organs and somewhere along the way something had muddied the wound, causing infection to set in. It looks like Haxton's going to be bedbound for a little while. With Doc looking out for his adopted daughter, it seemed likely that she would make it through without issue though. Clearly not content with the multitude of issues they'd caused the village already, the Mechanoids dropped yet another defoliator ship into the area. This one was better guarded than the last, and was also in range of the active clusters. All of this to say, Doc didn't dare try to engage the ship to destroy it. He would have to wait and hope that the range of its defoliation effect didn't quite reach their fields, and that he could come up with a solution before the pollution spread too far. Spending time in bed fighting off her infection proved to be quite the growth moment for Haxton. Spending so much time inside her own house, simply staring at the walls, had given her a minor passion for building, whilst having so little to look forward to in her day besides her food had given her an interest in cooking too. She was also determined to make sure that she could inflict this kind of suffering on anyone who wronged her or the distillery in the future, so her passion for shooting only increased. She also became interested in ecology as she watched Doc smear the odd-smelling herbal medicine that he'd made from roots onto her wounds every day. Thankfully, she soon overcame her infection and was able to get back out into the world to indulge in some of her many newfound passions. Using her expert knowledge of horticulture, Pinion was confident that the ground would soon thaw enough to encourage plant growth. Given the massive number of fields they had to contend with, she began planting them again immediately, so that once the weather was warmer in a couple of days, they wouldn't waste any of the growing time. Winter had one last surprise in store for the village, however, as a small army of 25 rabid beagles entered the area, looking to hunt for man. Haxton, Doc, Dynapla and Kanosh made their way to their perimeter wall, hoping to take down as many of the beagles as they could before they could enter the base. It turns out, however, that man-hunting beagles also perceive mechanoids as human-like enough to warrant murder. As such, the beagles launched an assault upon the mechanoid cluster at the front of the village. As brave as it was, it's safe to say that the dogs do not compare any more favourably against the advanced tech of the mechanoids than the village had been, and they were soon dispatched entirely. With another drop pod filled to the brim with booze, and the Green Inlet settlement already their allies, Doc had to select a new target to begin winning over. This time he opted for Moyle Pugwope, a settlement of the Pound faction. Pound had really hated the distillery, so although the pod was a good first step, there was a long way to go before they made an ally of Pound. Given the somewhat sketchy nature of their food supplies during the last 2 winters, Pinion suggests that they throw down a small extra field of corn down by the riverbank. Small enough to be light touch, but large enough to be a nice boon to their supplies. Through the extremely hard work of Pinion, Doc and Kanosh, just 2 days into the growing season they finished sowing the last of the fields. This season they'll really maximise every day of growing they can, to make sure that they have plenty to see them through the next winter. Despite winter just ending, the joy of the distillery's greenhouse shows itself, as, just days into the growing season, the group are already able to harvest a crop of hops to continue beer production. Even Haxton was getting in on the action, watching and learning from Dynapla, who at this point was essentially the group's master brewer. A neutral faction sent the village a message through their comms console asking to borrow one of the group to help them for a few days as they tried to set up a hospital. Given that everything was going smoothly at the distillery at the moment and that Doc wanted to both help the people and also gain their goodwill, he elected to send Fiorenza off on the shuttle to help them. It was only for 5 days and things were going smoothly here. They could afford to spare Fiorenza for a while, couldn't they? So far, the group hadn't had any luck finding a new home for any of their donkeys. Nobody that had passed through so far had any interest in purchasing them, and they were still multiplying, leading to a bit of a squeeze for resources in the donkey pen. In an effort to remedy this, Dynaplas suggested using more of the spare area in the base to expand the donkey enclosure, to ensure that they could continue to feed themselves from the wild grass. With the donkeys enjoying a new, largely expanded enclosure, the group decided to move Hershey Horse into the donkey enclosure too. They were worried that he was getting lonely stuck in the pen behind Dynaplas's house all on his own, and they wanted to make sure he had some friends to interact with. Since it looked as though they wouldn't be able to rebuild the entrance to the village anytime soon, what with the Infernal launcher still within range, the group built a new line of defences, a little further back and out of the range of the mechanoids, but where they could still take advantage of the difficult terrain that was the river. Moving Hershey Horse into the same pen as the donkeys may have quickly proven to be a bad idea, as, shortly after the move, 5 of the donkeys all came down with the flu. The group weren't interested in letting the poor donkeys suffer, however, so quickly rushed to tend to them with their herbal medicine supplies. Whether by contagion or pure coincidence, shortly after, Hershey Horse also became afflicted with the flu, and likewise received the best medical attention the village could afford him. The same day, looking to compound their issues, a force from the Betrayers drop-podded into the area, looking to lay siege to the village. As the group decided how to handle this, a local Timberwolf made his decision and began to attack the besiegers. Sadly, he proved little match for them, and wasn't even able to inflict that much damage before he was killed. The village had no artillery of their own to fire upon the attackers, and they couldn't live under the constant threat of a mortar crashing into them, so their only real option was a counterattack. If they could make the besiegers' position too dangerous for them to hold, they could likely lure them into attacking the village directly, allowing the Distillery group to take advantage of the defences they'd built. A couple of well-placed shots later, and the besiegers decided to charge the village. Dynaplas had taken a couple of hits in the process of antagonising them, but it wasn't anything major. The group retreated back behind the perimeter wall to await the approaching attackers. Thankara was waiting nearby. She couldn't shoot, but she could help patch someone up mid-fight if required. Conscious that they didn't have the advantage in either numbers or firepower, the group decided to take a risk and fire a shot at the dormant mech cluster that was in the path of the attackers. The shot had the intended effect, and the cluster sprung to life, shooting at the attackers whilst the Distillery group hid behind their walls. An intense firefight ensued. The defenders gained a small advantage from their position behind their walls, but the attackers were still able to thread a few shots through the embrasures and cause some damage on each of the defenders. One of the attackers was armed with Molotovs. If the attackers burnt a hole in the wall, they would enter the base through it, instead of fighting their way through the mechanoids at the front of the village. In order to force them to the front of their base before the fire could eat a hole in the wall, the defenders retreated further back behind their defences. Haxton had already gone down from her injuries, so Kanoish carried her further back and then began tending to her wounds. Doc insisted on ignoring his wounds for the moment in favour of tending to Dynaplas, believing that they were far enough away from the attackers that they were safe to rest for a moment. It soon became clear that the attackers could still reach them, so they moved towards the entrance of the village, hoping to put some space between them whilst also drawing the attackers in that direction. Realising that they still needed to put a lot more damage into the attackers, Kanoish settled for making sure that Haxton wasn't bleeding out before leaving her where she was to join the others at the front of the village. As they did so, the attackers finished dealing with the mech cluster to the south and began to focus their attentions on the villagers once more. As they retreated, the extent of Doc's injuries became apparent. If he didn't get medical treatment soon, death was almost a certainty. He pulled back further into the village to try and get enough cover to tend to himself. As the defenders reached the front of the village, so too did the attackers. It was here that they engaged with the mech clusters which had so long plagued the entrance of the village. Whilst they did this, Thankara pulled back to the other edge of the wall to try and put out the fire. A harsh rain was falling, but the fire was intense, and she didn't want to leave the fate of the wall to the whims of the weather. While she did this, Dynaplas and Kanoish flanked the attackers from behind the wall, firing into their backs whilst they fought against the mechanoids. Sadly, the attackers made quick work of what remained of that mech cluster, and they were soon making for the village. They'd taken a lot of damage, but not enough to send them running before they did some serious damage of their own. A stray bullet sent through an embrasure finally sent Dynapla to the floor, leaving the job of repelling the attackers at the front to Kinosh alone. One of the freshest and least damaged attackers made it into the village to duke it out with Kinosh. He managed to get behind Kinosh and get into cover, leaving Kinosh in a terrible position. Doc was still bleeding out badly and in the middle of tending to his wounds, but he ventured back into the fray, hoping that he could flank the attacker and save Kinosh. Unfortunately, Doc's injuries made him slow to reinforce, and as Kinosh broke from cover to try to avoid the attacker coming in behind her, she was finally knocked to the ground. Doc soon took another shot to the head, sending him sprawling too, leaving only Thankuara and Pinion left on their feet. Thankuara knew she would be no use with the gun, so attempted to close the distance to bash the attacker with her beer bottle. Unfortunately, she was too slow and was also sent to the floor. Once Thankuara was out of the picture, the attackers declared victory and decided to kidnap those that had been incapacitated and then leave. Unfortunately for them, they'd failed to account for Dynapla's tenacity. He had managed to drag himself back to his feet and, grabbing his auto pistol, made short work of the attacker who was trying to kidnap Thankuara. They'd done it. Against all odds, they had survived, with no deaths either. Well, no deaths so far at any rate. Kinosh, Doc and Thankuara were all in a very bad way and would soon die without any medical care. Dynapla and Haxton also needed some attention, but they were in no immediate danger. Between Pinion and Dynapla, they were able to successfully stabilise all of the group, but not before most experienced severe blood loss, meaning that they would likely be out of commission for a while and relying on Dynapla and Pinion to care for them. Given the severity of the injuries and the fact that they had to be tended whilst lying in the dirt outside, it's no surprise when the infections start to show up. Doc gets an infection in his left arm, while Haxton ends up with two, one in her right foot and one in her torso. Given the pain he's in, the stress he's under, and the lack of food, it's no wonder that Dynapla ends up having a mental breakdown and binging on smoke leaf. The lack of food becomes a real battle. With no food stored and only Dynapla and Pinion to handle the needs of all of the 7 colonists, they're stretched incredibly thin, and trying to make sure they can forage enough food from the environment to feed themselves and all of their patients is very tricky. The field of onions is marked for an early harvest, but even finding time for that will be tricky given the number of infections that require tending each day. Dynapla is doing his best, even foraging for wild healroot to supplement his supplies, but even still, all of the infections seem to be outpacing his ability to treat them. Dynapla consults with Doc on the best way forward. Doc is experienced enough to know the answer. He instructs Dynapla to amputate his left arm, cutting off the infection before it can kill him. Dynapla is horrified, and concerned that Doc might simply be delirious from the pain, but he knows that if he does nothing the infection will kill him, so it seems like he only has one option. Thankfully, Dynapla's medical experience was earned in combat, so he manages an amputation with little hassle. Haxton's infections pose a different issue altogether though. If it was just her foot they could amputate it too, but they can't exactly amputate her neck. They'll need to think of something else. With Doc more cognizant now that he's not fighting the infection, he makes a request of Dynapla. They are all aware of the ancient ruins nearby, but Doc has heard of people finding all manner of strange things in such ruins. Some even speak of finding stores of luciferium in them. He doesn't wish to curse his daughter with luciferium, but with her infections in such an advanced stage, it might be the only way. He asks Dynapla to break into the ruins and see what options it might provide them. The ruins contain a number of small insectoids and some ancient cryptosleep caskets, but no sign of luciferium. Dynapla relays this information to Doc, whose eyes light up. A chance. He instructs Dynapla to return to the ruins and empty the caskets. Once that's done, he's to collect Haxton and inter her in one of the caskets. It's not ideal, but it'll keep her in a suspended state, meaning the infections cannot spread. That'll give them all the time they need to find an alternative solution. Pinion offers to help and returns to the ruins to open the caskets. 2 of them contain corpses, but the other 2 contain still living, albeit very injured, people, Zigomano and Mela Borma. Dynapla carries Haxton up to the ruins and puts her in one of the caskets, closing it again to activate it, while Pinion stands guard to protect them from the insectoids. With the task completed, they destroy the insectoid hive to stop them reproducing, and then decide to rescue the two people who have just come out the caskets. They were still an altruistic colony after all, they wouldn't just abandon people who need help. Speaking of people who need help, the insectoids had gone the long way around to get into the village, and had ambushed Doc, knocking him to the floor and leaving him bleeding out for the second time in as many days. Dynapla and Pinion managed to get into the spare room with their two rescuees before the insectoids could catch up to them, allowing them to tend to their wounds. Once it was clear that they would survive, they ventured back outside into the village to hunt down each of the remaining insectoids. With both Pinion and Kinoish breaking down due to stress and pain, Doc and Thankuara both being mauled by insectoids, Haxton in suspended animation and Pisano being a baby, it was left to Dynapla to hold everything together. Everybody's moods were in the gutter, and understandably so, but they had managed to get through the worst of it. Now they just needed to rest and heal up. And, with perfect timing, as soon as all the hard work was done, Fiorenzo returned from his vacation to the other colony to build a hospital. It was quite the sight to return to be fair. Soon after, they received more good news. Zigo Mano had decided to join the colony after they'd rescued her. Well, it initially seemed like a good thing, however Zigo wasn't necessarily going to be the greatest help to them. She was a pyromaniac who'd grown up as a talented bard on a medieval planet. Unfortunately, she knew she was talented, and had used it as an excuse to avoid any hard work her whole life, meaning that she would be of little help around the village. Her attitude immediately put her at odds with Doc, who decided to only speak to her in the future if he needed some artwork made. Thankfully, the disappointment of Zigo was countered almost immediately by the news that Mila Borma had also wished to join the colony. Mila Borma had been a corporate drone, so was no stranger to hard work, and in fact, he was often accused by his former colleagues of being a workaholic. He also had a passion for working with plants, which he'd never had the freedom to explore during his time as a corporate drone. Doc was ecstatic to welcome him to the colony and point him to the fields, where he could work to his heart's content and indulge in his passion all at the same time. Whilst everyone had been getting to grips with the new colonists, recovering from their multitude of injuries, as well as the mental strain of the past few days, baby Pisano had been growing the whole time, and was now officially a child. Passing combat supplier hailed the village on their comms console and offered some items in trade. Following the onslaught of infections and the poor outcomes they'd managed to get from them, Dynapla was only too happy to part with some of the silver to purchase some industrial medicine. Deciding that he didn't like Zigo enough to spend time around her, Doc relegated her to the night shift with Pinion and Kinoish. What they did to deserve that, I'm not quite sure, but she was their curse to bear now. Given how much damage that single raid had done to them, even if mostly indirectly, Doc is still getting more and more concerned about the scale of the dangers they're now facing, and is ever more determined to make allies in the region. As they seem to have managed to stockpile some wine and chemshine during all of their recent madness, he instructs them to send it to Pound, who graciously accept, turning them from hostile to neutral towards the distillery, in the face of their extensive generosity. With the influx of new villagers to the group, they needed to construct an additional home to house them. They put this one further to the south. The north of the village was almost completely full, and might need to use what little space is left to expand any animal pens as and when required. It wasn't what he'd hoped for, but with the food supplies being low before, and now having additional mouths to feed, Doc had little choice but to order that some of the donkeys be butchered. He was careful to leave a breeding pair, so that they could still potentially sell some donkeys further down the line. But for now, if they didn't do this, there wouldn't be a further down the line. They had originally opened the side of the ancient ruins outside of their walls, just in case there'd been something super dangerous in there that they would want to be on the outside of their walls. Now that they'd handled the dangers it contained, however, they bricked it back up again, so as to avoid having any attackers try to access Haxton's casket. Doc still wanted access, however, so that he could visit Haxton while she rested, so he requested that a tunnel be dug through the mountain for him to access the ruins from the village. As the days pass, everyone's wounds, both physical and mental, have begun to heal. So naturally it's the perfect time for a bit of a curveball, this time in the form of a space battle occurring in orbit just above the planet. The debris from the fight is crashing down around the village, including ship chunks as well as people who narrowly escape the ship, usually with severe injuries. Doc would love to help as many of them as he can, but running into the field to save them is always a big risk, as you never know when the next piece of debris is going to land. A man named Corey lands right next to their perimeter wall, so Doc can't help but try and save him. He sends Kanoish out to grab him and drag him back to the village for treatment. Just as Doc is contemplating trying to help more of the survivors, a wild cougar kindly demonstrates why that's a poor idea, as a piece of space debris falls directly upon it, completely shredding it. Thankful to Doc and the village for rescuing him, Corey asks to stay with them, which they happily accept. Corey grew up with the heart of an artist, but when his tribe's elder was killed in a raid, he was forced to take a different path, becoming the tribe's healer and spending his days foraging for herbs and tending to his people. His dedication to his people had made him a hard worker, and he was often found jogging through the forest, both for exercise and simply to cover more ground during his foraging work. He was passionate about many subjects and would likely fit in well at the distillery. With the arrival of Corey, Zigo and Mila Borma, things had taken a slight turn for the better, but it had been a roller coaster of a few days at the distillery. Hopefully the extra hands would make light work of the farming and brewing though, and they'd soon be able to win over everyone in the region. Hey guys, Tuna here. Well, that was a bit more of a wild ride than I was expecting, don't know about you. I had expected this to be the final episode of this series, but after that raid there was just too much going on. I'm a big believer in letting the story tell itself, so I didn't want to rush through it. So hey, I guess we get another episode of Dr. King's Distillery next week. Thank you guys once again for watching and for the support on these series, it really does mean a lot to me. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you again next Saturday for more.